Hello, hello, hello. It's me, Dr. Z. I'm joined by my 5-year-old son named Owen. Say hi, Owen.
Hi.
And I'm also joined today by my 5-month-old daughter named Lila. Say hi, Lila. She doesn't know how to talk yet.
Hi, Naveed.
Owen, do you think she has anything to say?
Hi, Naveed. Say hi.
Say goo goo gaga. She's trying her best.
Hi, Naveed. God.
Anyway, welcome back. Hello. In this episode, we're diving into the cerebellum, which is a structure that is absolutely essential for smooth, coordinated movement, but it also plays an important role in cognition, emotion, and social behavior. This is all from chapter 15 of our textbook, Neuroscience Fundamentals for Rehabilitation by Lori Lundy-Ekman. So, the cerebellum, even though the cerebellum doesn't directly initiate movement or generate strength, damage to it can be incredibly disabling. So, in this episode, we're going to break down what the cerebellum does, how it is organized, how information flows through it, and what happens when things go wrong. She swam. Wow. Okay. All right. Sorry. There may be occasional distractions in this episode. All right. Back to the cerebellum. Let's start here with the big picture. What does the cerebellum actually do? Well, at its core, the cerebellum adjusts posture and coordinates movement. Its job is to make movements smooth, accurate, and appropriately timed. And to do that, it integrates information from several sources. We have the frontal lobes, which tell the cerebellum what movement is intended. We also have the vestibular receptors and the proprioceptors, which provide information about body position and motion. And we have information about motor activity in the brainstem and the spinal cord. Now, one key thing to remember is that all cerebellar processing is non conscious. Another important concept, there are no direct connections between the cerebellum and lower motor neurons. Instead, the cerebellum influences movement by modifying activity in upper motor neuron systems, including the motor cortex and brainstem motor nuclei. This explains a classic point. Cerebellar damage does not cause weakness or sensory loss. Instead, it causes poor coordination and impaired postural control. Sorry, brief intermission to turn off this noisy child toy. All right, that's better. Here you go, baby. Okay, moving on now to some of the anatomy, the cellular anatomy of the cerebellar cortex. So, the cerebellar cortex is made of gray matter that's arranged into 3 layers. We have the outer molecular layer, which contains interneurons. We have the middle layer, which contains Purkinje cell bodies. And we have the inner granular layer, which is rich in interneurons. Purkinje cells are especially important because they are the only output neurons of the cerebellar cortex. Incoming information reaches the cerebellum through 2 excitatory fiber types, and they are called the mossy fibers and climbing fibers. These fibers carry afferent information into the cerebellum, and they synapse on Purkinje cells, and this shapes cerebellar output. So, gross anatomy wise, anatomically, the cerebellum lies inferior to the occipital lobes, and it connects the brainstem via 3 paired fiber bundles called the cerebellar peduncles. We have the superior cerebellar peduncle, which connects the cerebellum to the midbrain, the middle cerebellar peduncle, which connects to the pons, and the inferior cerebellar peduncle, which connects to the medulla. We also have the cerebellar hemisphere, and each cerebellar hemisphere contains 3 lobes: the anterior lobe, the posterior lobe, and the flocculonodular lobe. That's a fun word. And then vertically, we can divide the cerebellum into the vermis at the midline, the paravermal region, and the lateral hemispheres. These anatomical divisions line up closely with the cerebellum's functional regions, which is where things really will start to click now. So the cerebellum has three major functional divisions, and each is responsible for different aspects of movement and behavior. Starting with the vestibulocerebellum, this is located in the flocculonodular lobe. There's that fun word again. It receives input from the ipsilateral vestibular apparatus and the ipsilateral vestibular nuclei. This region integrates vestibular and visual information and sends projections back to the vestibular nuclei. And its primary roles are balance and equilibrium, postural control, and the control of eye movements. Now, damage to this area commonly results in nystagmus, which is an involuntary beating of the eyes, unsteadiness, and difficulty maintaining sitting and standing balance. So that was the vestibulocerebellum. Moving on now to our second functional region of the cerebellum, which is the spinocerebellum. And this includes the vermis of the anterior lobe and the paravermal region. This region has extensive connections within the spinal cord, and it receives information about the movement commands from the cortex, the activity of spinal cord neurons, and proprioceptive feedback from muscles and joints. The spinal cerebellum uses this information then to make anticipatory, corrective, and responsive adjustments during movement. Information from the body reaches the cerebellum through the spinocerebellar tracts, which do not reach conscious awareness. Oh, brief pause. So there are two high accuracy proprioceptive pathways. Hold on. Just a moment. So there are two high accuracy proprioceptive pathways. We have the posterior spinal cerebellar pathway, and this carries information from the lower limb and the trunk. And then we also have the cuneo-cerebellar pathway, which carries information from the upper limb, the neck, and the upper trunk. Both of these pathways transmit precise, somatotopically organized information directly to the cerebellar cortex. The cerebellum also receives internal feedback about motor commands via the anterior spinocerebellar tract and the rostrospinocerebellar tract. These tracts monitor spinal interneurons and descending motor signals, and they help the cerebellum to compare intended movement with the actual execution of movement. Even though the spinal cerebellum does not send signals directly to motor neurons, it absolutely influences movement by projecting to the brainstem motor nuclei and the motor cortical areas. This indirect influence is why cerebellar lesions cause coordination problems without actual paresis, which means weakness or paralysis. A last functional area of the cerebellum is the cerebrocerebellum. The cerebrocerebellum has extensive connections with nearly the entire cerebral cortex, especially the frontal lobes. Functions of the cerebrocerebellum include the planning and timing of voluntary movement, coordination of fine distal movements, and cognitive processing. So the typical circuit we see is motor command information from the cerebral cortex, then goes to the pontine nuclei and to the lateral cerebellar cortex. It then continues to something called the dentate nucleus in the cerebellum. And then after the cerebellum fine tunes that motor command that came down from the motor cortex, it sends information now back up to the thalamus, because remember, the thalamus is the relay center of the brain, and from the thalamus to the cerebral cortex. So now we can have that motor plan that's been perfected sent down to the spinal cord to synapse with lower motor neurons. So I mentioned the dentate nucleus here. I want you to know that the dentate nucleus plays a major role in motor planning. So think dentate nucleus, motor planning. It makes adjustments before movement is executed. So the cerebellum is not just about movement. Surprisingly, we don't think of the cerebellum when we think of this, but the cerebellum also contributes to goal directed behavior, language optimization, visual spatial processing, emotional regulation, and social behavior. The red nucleus participates in circuits that integrate motor, cognitive, and emotional functions, and this reinforces the cerebellum's role beyond pure motor control. Okay, so we talked about the gross anatomy and the cellular anatomy of the cerebellum. We mentioned our three functional regions of the cerebellum. Now, let's talk about some signs of cerebellar dysfunction. So, a hallmark feature of cerebellar dysfunction is ataxia, and this affects posture, automatic movements, eye movements, and voluntary movements. A key exam rule here is that unilateral cerebellar lesion causes ipsilateral deficits. Just a minute. So unilateral cerebellar lesions cause ipsilateral deficits. And this is because cerebellar input and output pathways either double cross or remain uncrossed in a way that ultimately affects the same side of the body. So we see some specific patterns based on where lesions are in the cerebellum. Lesions to the vestibulocerebellum result in nystagmus and balance problems. Vermis lesions result in truncal ataxia. So that's going to be ataxia observed specifically at the trunk. Then we have paravermal lesions, which leads to limb ataxia, as well as dysarthria and gait ataxia. With those paravermal lesions, we also see dysdiadochokinesia, which is the inability to rapidly pronate and supinate the upper extremities. We also see dysmetria, and this is when someone may reach either too far or not far enough to grasp an object that they intend to grab or point to or touch. You also see an action tremor with paravermal lesions. And an action tremor is when there's no tremor at rest, but once someone lifts their limb to reach towards something or to do something with that limb, we then see a tremor. We also see movement decomposition with paravermal lesions. Last, we have our cerebrocerebellar lesions. Lesions to this area leads to difficulty with fine motor tasks like buttoning, typing, or playing instruments. And sometimes we see dysarthria with cerebrocerebellar lesions as well. All right, so vestibulocerebellum, I want you to think balance. You're going to see impaired balance with lesion to this vestibulocerebellum. Lesions to the spinocerebellar areas, we're going to see more gross ataxia, so it affects our gross motor skills. And then cerebrocerebellar lesions, we're thinking more fine motor impairment. Okay, next I want to touch on distinguishing between cerebellar and somatosensory ataxia. And the distinction is very testable through an exam called the Romberg test. So to differentiate between cerebellar and somatosensory ataxia, you're going to have the patient or client stand with their eyes open and with their eyes closed. This is just static standing in one place with their feet together and maybe their arms crossed over their chest. In cerebellar ataxia, we're going to see that the coordination is impaired regardless of vision. This person will also demonstrate normal vibration sense and proprioception, and deep tendon reflexes will appear normal. Now, in contrast, somatosensory ataxia worsens significantly when you have someone close their eyes and you remove their sense of vision, which they have been depending on to compensate for somatosensory deficits. Cerebellar dysfunction may be seen in stroke, in multiple sclerosis, in tumors, as well as alcoholic degeneration of the brain. Developmental disorders such as autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, and dyslexia. There's also something called cerebellar cognitive affective syndrome, which affects visual spatial skills, language. Oh, Lila had something to say. She wanted to participate in the podcast. So that last diagnosis I mentioned is cerebellar cognitive affective syndrome, which affects visuospatial skills, language, executive function, and emotional regulation. All right, a few final takeaways here. Thank goodness we're about done because my 5-month-old does not like recording podcasts, right? Do you not like doing this? So, our final takeaways: the cerebellum is more densely packed with neurons than the cerebrum. It receives more input than it sends. It operates entirely outside of conscious awareness. And it coordinates movement and posture, but it also optimizes cognitive, emotional, and social function. Understanding the cerebellum is less about memorizing tracks and it's more about recognizing patterns of dysfunction. And that's exactly how it shows up on exams and in clinical practice. Okay, that's all for today. Bye.